Hello students. Today in this video we will go over Chapter 3, highlighting some of the more important elements within this chapter. So Chapter 3 is about the cultural environment, something that you may need to include in your first assignment as well as the case project at the end. Let's just preview. So let's go. There's a few slides in this chapter that is just filled with material you need to read. We have two people, Edward Taylor and Gert Hofstede, defining what culture is. We're going to look at the work of Hofstede later on in this chapter. He is probably the leading expert on cultural dimensions within the workplace. So we'll look at his work throughout this chapter. Understanding that culture is an element or a characteristic of society, it helps shape our own individual behavior by identifying what is appropriate and what's not appropriate in forms of human behavior and interaction. In a sense, culture is the programming of the mind that distinguishes members from one human group from another. What makes us different? So why is being aware of different cultures important? In Chapter 2, we looked at political, economic, and legal differences. Later on in Chapter 4, we'll look at ethical differences. Tying all that in with the political, economic, legal is being aware of the different cultures. Organizations, if they do their homework properly when they are investigating different international business opportunities, if they do their homework correctly, they will do quite well. If they don't do their homework well, if they don't understand the political, economic, legal risks of going into a country, and if they misunderstand or are not aware of cultural differences, you're going to look at significant business failure. A couple of these examples, or at least one example that I'll highlight today, is with Target 3-4 years ago when they decided to venture into Canada. They failed within, I think it was maybe 2 years. And there's a couple articles that I'll put on a Blackboard as well about why Target failed and what other companies can learn from it, as being this one. The other one is The Last Days of Target, more of a blog article type scenario. And of course the frustrations that customers had, the employees had, in terms of the failure of the executives and managers in making key decisions. Reading through this article, it's when they left Canada after 2 years or 3 years and losing, $4 or $5 billion. A lot of it was not understanding the cultural differences within Canada, and not even looking at as simple as looking at a map to see how big Canada is. One of the things that they assumed that they could have 2 distribution centers for all of Canada, one in Winnipeg and one in Toronto, and those distribution centers within the Canadian trucking regulations should be able to service all of Canada, without, obviously they didn't look at a map and they didn't understand the trucking regulations that would, you'd need more than one or more than 2 distribution centers. Another example of the reason why they failed is they assumed that the Texas market what would be the same as markets up in Canada. Um, One example that I learned from or heard from a manager at Target is that they were shipped without um, they were shipped from headquarters. So the local managers did not know that they were going to get this shipment. The shipment contained pallets and pallets of charcoal briquettes and charcoal-based barbecues. Something that typically we in Canada don't do. We don't barbecue with charcoal. Um, in Texas, in southern states, it's more popular to do so, but here we barbecue with natural gas or propane or natural gas. And so they received all these shipments, and basically, one of the example of many that they just assumed that the markets in the states were going to be what they would experience up here. So one of the examples of not understanding your market. So the first thing within understanding cultural awareness is trying to understand different values and norms. The values form the bedrock of the culture. Norms are the social rules that govern people's actions, behavior towards one another. Violating those social norms can be met with, a little awkwardness or met with more severe type penalties. Norms can be divided further into two major groups, folkways and mores, and we'll look at both of those in more detail. Folkways are the routine conventions of everyday life. Good example, as it says, is attitude towards time. People are very time conscious in Canada, whereas other countries like Jamaica, a 2 o'clock meeting in the afternoon could be, just sometime in the afternoon. If you arrive, late or early, it's no big deal. Whereas in Canada, it's something that is going to send a negative message if you are late. So the folkways, as I said, are routine conventions of everyday life. Examples would be how we dress, eating habits, social graces. An outsider, if they break one of those folkways, can be easily forgiven for being ignorant of that folkway. So something to discuss, we'll perhaps discuss this in class when we go over this material, is say there's an 8 o'clock party on a Friday night. What time would you arrive? Do you arrive 5 minutes early, half an hour early? Do you arrive 5 minutes late? Half an hour late? What is appropriate? If you're hosting a party, when would you want people to be there? Say it's a dinner party. Half an hour early, 10 minutes early. Is it wrong to be an hour late? Kind of thing. Whereas in our culture, we're going to have different responses to that, and if you've lived in other places in the world, your idea of what is appropriate could be different. Similar to this is what's appropriate behavior in an elevator or when you're standing in line, say at a bank or a grocery store. Do you speak to people around you? Generally in Canada we have what is called civil inattention, where we can kind of ignore people around us and we're not being rude. It's just like if you're on a bus, you don't talk to people generally. It's very awkward if people, talk to you in those settings. And mores are more serious in terms of the consequences if they are broken. Negative mores are those taboos, usually supported by religious or philosophical sanctions, whereas the folkways guide human conduct, behavior in more mundane areas of life. Mores tend to control those aspects connected with family and religion. Mores can vary greatly between countries. What in one country may be viewed as innocent flirt, for example, in another country may constitute a more serious affront to someone's dignity or even harassment. Um, Drinking alcohol as well in some countries is appropriate in business settings and not appropriate at all in other country settings. Culture, society, and the nation state. Basically saying that there's not that strict one-to-one correspondence between a society and a nation state. Some examples of this we'll just highlight over here. Examples of places in the world where the political boundaries do not equal the same culture. Canada, we have it. We have different cultures between English, French, and First Nations. Iraq, Sunni and Shiite. Sri Lanka. Others would include West and East Germany after World War II, where it was divided, and for many years, many decades, their culture became quite different because of the different political and economic systems in there. When the wall came down, there was one country, and there were cultural differences between what an appropriate work schedule and work motivation were between people from East and West Germany. Yugoslavia, 1999, is another good example. After that civil war, the country was divided into, 5 or 6 different countries where the difference was based on religious, language, cultural factors. The determinants of culture. We're going to talk briefly about those 6 areas. The individual and groups. United States, because it's more individualistic, the emphasis is on individual performance, individual ratings, and more individual-based success. Whereas just understanding that individuals are part of various groups, individuals do belong to more than one group, and there you get that conflict when you meet someone from one of your other groups in a different group setting. This could be class setting or different sports settings or religious settings, and you meet someone in that group in a different group setting. And how do you interact with that person? How do you interact with your boss when from work he's your boss or she's your boss? In another setting, you might be peers. You might be on a same hockey team, and you got that cultural, or you got that individual group kind of disconnect. In some social settings, Asian employees often say that they work, for example, they work for Sony. That's how they might introduce themselves. Whereas a Western-based employee may say that he or she is an electrical engineer. In Asia, the worth of that individual is more linked to the success of the group than the individual achievement. So Asian employees will say, yes, I work for Sony. Western employee will say that, I'm an electrical engineer, as a way of introduction.